Chapter 1, Setting the Stage. An overview. The other day, I was just looking back at my high school days. It all seemed like I was watching some movie. I would consider myself a relatively introverted child since my childhood, though an inquisitive one. While my introverted nature made me sit with myself for hours, the inquisitive part of me kept on thinking why the things were the way they were. Moreover, since I was born in a lower-middle-class family, the opportunity to study in a reasonable school, play in the evening, and sleep with full stomach was luxury for us. Of course, it is way better than those kids who had to work or help their parents in their work from an early age. I remember I just had a limited number of friends with whom I could openly share my thoughts about my desire to explore ways to improve life, be it personal, financial, or just living better. During my first college days, besides my studies, I was trying to learn and understand other topics like the stock market, how a corporation operates and made profits, and trying to be aware of the trend. It was a book about mind-power study techniques for enhancing my learning skills. The book had good material, and it helped me with few techniques to learn and understand better. Moreover, I also worked with some other intelligent students in my class to understand their style of learning and retention, and noted that they were following certain methodologies to learn better. Precisely all efforts on how to learn better were on my own, as generally most schools only required students to learn the subject matter, but not the best ways to learn. I completed college, my professional education, and then started working in the corporate world, and those learning techniques helped me. My desire for learning stayed with me. I was reading various types of literature from high-profile business magazines like The Economist to thought-provoking business books on thinking, decision-making, and learning better. Though I was consuming more information, there was still a nagging feeling in my mind that there could still be improved ways to accelerate my learning. Though my earlier understanding of ways of learning was self-studied, it served me well throughout my life so far. Therefore, I became curious about learning the ways to learn better, faster, retain information for long term, in order to improve my ability to retrieve the information. This is because I strongly believe that learning is not something that should stop after you finish college. Rather, it is a lifelong process. But anyways, it still gives me a sense of satisfaction the time I spent researching has equipped me with refined tools that will now remain with me for life to learn effectively. Your questions about accelerated learning. Maybe you also have some questions about the ways to learn better, faster, and more effectively. You may have questions like, how does our brain's neural network and memory work, and what are the best ways to firmly store new pieces of information in our brain? What is the effectiveness of the learning methods that we have knowingly or unknowingly used so far in learning material? Have our schools or colleges ever taught us about the best ways to learn for long-term retention, or were we just forced to cram our test material only to regurgitate it in an exam the next morning? What are the best ways to get maximum ROTI, return on time invested, in reading and learning new information, i.e., retain the most information so we can retrieve and make the best decisions out of that information? I don't know about your precise objective of learning the ways to learn faster and better, but I assume that you have resonated with some of the questions above. And if you stay with me, I promise you to provide you enough valuable techniques based on my positive experience of implementing them and many other strategies explored through my further research that will help you accelerate your learning process. Readers read such books faster. To be candid with you, I write books to enhance my learning on different types of subjects. This is because one of the best ways of learning is to teach someone. There You will find a complete section on how teaching is proven to be one of the most effective techniques for learning. Therefore, whatever topics I find interesting and want to learn more about, I read and research about the topic, try to incorporate it into my life, and then start teaching that topic through my books. So, this book will be short, but full of actionable information. Or, specifically, this book will cover how your brain works and the role of memory in enhanced learning, different types of learning strategies, and how most commonly used strategies for learning are not that effective. Few less known learning strategies for better comprehension and motivation. Myths about different learning styles and how you should take notes while learning something new. How you can learn by making learning a fun experience. Gamification and challenges to help you to learn faster. Research studies and use of technology to show how teaching someone is the best way to learn. Stages of learning and how to reach the top level of learning to become an expert in your field. Chapter 2. Decoding the Brain-Memory Connection. A Journey into Cognition. The objective of learning faster requires careful examination of all the factors related to the process of learning. Human brain is the key infrastructure for imbibing any new learning. Therefore, we will first start with the internal functioning of our brains. To be precise, learning at a very basic level is a biological function with our brain as the main component to facilitate this. When you're reading this page, you wouldn't realize how many functions your brain is handling at this single point of time. Your brain is instructing your eyes to read the words on this page. Then, after reading the images of the words, your brain is forming connections within itself to derive some meaning out of those words, which will then become your understanding of the concept. While reading, your brain is also doing a lot more functions within you and around you, and all of this is happening at such a fast pace that you even don't realize all this happening because our brain is possibly the most complex object known to us. I guess you would now be interested in knowing the complex infrastructure inside the brain that facilitates learning. Let's now get inside the brain to examine how our brains understand from the multitude of information consistently bombarding it every moment of life. Neuroscience studies show that the human brain has more than 100 billion neurons. One important transaction that happens within the brain is when neurons pass on signals to the other neurons. Current brain research supports the idea that most learning and development happens in the brain through the strengthening and weakening of these synaptic connections. There is some estimation that each neuron may have anywhere from 1 to 10,000 synaptic connections, and therefore the number of different patterns of possible connections in the brain is about 40 quadrillion, a number that is beyond comprehension of a normal human being. These neurons are the basic functional cells that appear to control learning. They encode, store, and retrieve information, as well as influence all aspects of human behavior. Neurons act like tiny batteries sending chemical and electrical signals that create processes to integrate and generate information. Whenever we learn something new, that information is stored in the brain through connection between different neurons. Apparently, all our learning and information occurs through the connection between the neurons. For any new learning to form in our brains, it is vital that the neurons fire a lot and make numerous synaptic connections, which only happens through consistent repetition and practice. The idea of taking a quick peep inside your brain is to give you some brief update about the internal infrastructure and invisible function happening within our brains that facilitate learning. It would also be better here to have a broad understanding of one other important aspect of learning: memory. What is the role of memory in the learning process? Functionally, memory is defined as the capability to encode, hold, and subsequently remember material in the brain. From a psychological and neurological viewpoint tone, memory is the collection of encoded neural connections in the brain. It is the rebuilding of previous happenings and practices by a synchronous firing of neurons that were fired at the time of learning. Our memory plays a key role in any new learning. After all, what is the use of learning anything new when you are not able to retrieve the information at the required time? Having a stronger memory facilitates quicker decision-making, as you can quickly process the data in your brain and come out with a solution. Rather, they have strengthened their memory in a way that helps them to retrieve information in the real time, and when it is most needed. Memory is therefore very crucial to learning. We can say that memory is a storage system formed within specific neural pathways, while learning is all about changing those old neural pathways and thus altering the thinking and behavior of a person through the infusion of new information. Learning and memory are closely connected because the objective of the learning is to imbibe new knowledge into our memory. New memory, formed through learning, will, in turn, help us to make better decisions. Memorization is the process through which we store and retrieve information for use later when we need it. That's what is required in the process of learning anything new. Encoding is processing the information from your all senses. You are processing information every time in all manners. While listening, touching, or smelling, you are exposing yourself to some information to process through your brain. Storage is the process of storing the information in the neural pathways of our brains. In the coming sections, we will learn about the best ways to encode the information in a way that helps to strengthen the storage of information in our brains. Retrieval is the most important function and objective of our memory. First, you need to understand the function of your brain. Therefore, we looked at the deeper layers of the brain to understand the operating system of our brain. Secondly, we also discussed the concept of memory, as it is the necessary mechanism to retain any new learning in our brain. In the next sections, we will talk about the important learning techniques with the pros and cons of each technique and the best ways to retain the information in your brain. Chapter 3. Unlocking Comprehension, Strategies for Deep Understanding. Do you recall any specific classes or instructions during your school days where they taught you how to learn effectively and in a way that sustains? I don't remember being taught about the best ways to learn. We were simply given the subject matter to be learned, and we had to figure out intuitively the way to learn. The methods I remember using in the childhood to learn was cramming most of the time, at least for theoretical subjects like history or geography, for examinations. Maybe that information is not relevant for our day-to-day living. Maybe we are not interested in those subjects, or maybe there was some defect in our learning methods. Another way I recall was to learn by just forcing my mind to recall the information through hiding with my hand the answers to the questions that I just read. Most of you would also recollect learning through rereading the information to store the information in your memory. We are used to using these various ways to learn, but the key concern is that though we use these different techniques, we are not sure of the efficacy of the ways of learning. We are always being informed of what we need to learn, but never has there been any greater emphasis on how we should learn. That's why we wonder why most of the information we try to learn in our day-to-day lives don't seem to stick in our brain. To start, let's learn something about why we forget. Researcher H.F. Spitzer submitted a research paper too at State University of Iowa, wherein he conducted an experiment to test how much information a person is able to retain in his memory if he learns the textbook material without using any memory methods. The picture below explains the concept of the forgetting curve, and it shows how after learning information, we lose the information in a matter of a couple of days or weeks if there are no attempts made to retain it. The graph above shows that typically humans tend to significantly lose the newly learned knowledge from their memory in a matter of days, unless they consciously review the learned material. Suppose, as a student, you read some information about people, places, or other facts about the Second World War today for the first time, and then don't make any attempt to revise or recollect the information by the end of the week. There are two key concerns that I want to highlight here that become hindrances in solidifying our learning and retaining the information in our brains. 1. We are not sure that we are using the best ways to learn something new. This results in a waste of significant amount of our precious time due to not using the right methodology to learn. The spacing effect is the phenomenon whereby learning is greater when studying is spread out over time, as opposed to studying the same amount of content in a single session. It means it is better to use spaced presentation rather than mass presentation. You will learn more about these later in this section. Practically, this effect suggests that cramming intense, last-minute studying solely to address the examination the night before an exam is not likely to be as effective as studying at intervals in a longer time frame. The objective of this section is to examine the various study methods that we have used so far commonly in our practice and the efficacy of such methods. We need to learn the methods that will address the problem of the forgetting curve. To put it succinctly, you will examine the methods and then figure out the best ways to learn the new information by the end of this chapter. Thankfully, we don't need to start from scratch to assess the various methods of learning. The psychologist John Dunlosky from Kent State University has already conducted decades of research on different learning techniques to examine the efficacy of the various techniques. He and his team of researchers finally concluded that effectively there are 10 learning methodologies. Here are the 10 learning techniques examined by Dunlosky for testing their effectiveness. 6. Practice testing. Besides the 10 methods above, Dunlosky's team also looked at some computer-driven tutors and other technologies that showed some promise in effective learning. Dunlosky and his team's research revealed some surprising facts about the effectiveness of different methods of learning. It shows that the methods that are most commonly used for learning are not the most effective ways of learning. Yet there are some not so commonly used learning methods that have proven to deliver good results. Yay! Methods commonly used in learning but ineffective for long-term retention. There are 5 commonly used methods in our education system, or we generally use them when we read something for gaining knowledge, but these are not very effective for learning. A survey conducted at one renowned university revealed that a whopping 84 of the students used rereading and highlighting see next method as a method of learning. Also, rereading doesn't always enhance the understanding of the subject, and also its benefits are not long-lasting as compared to the other methods that you will learn later in this section, meaning that students first actively assessed the importance of information and then only highlighted rather than just read and highlighted every second sentence of the textbook. Highlighting may appear to be effective because you apply additional emphasis on the highlighted portion, but there is a study that showed that highlighting as a method of learning didn't help. That the group of students who highlighted the text and then revised the text at a later stage performed the worst in terms of recalling the information as compared to the other group who reviewed the clean text. Dunlosky concluded that highlighting is merely a starting point of learning and therefore needs to be accompanied by more effective studying methods. In this learning technique, the students are required to summarize what they have learned about a subject. The central point of this technique is that you should be able to write down in shortest form the central idea of the information you just learned while disregarding the unimportant information. Though this technique is useful, The limitation of this technique is that it requires teaching the students how to summarize to enhance learning and retention. One study showed that the students who were given the required coaching on the best ways to summarize the reading material were able to recall the information as compared to the others who were not given the coaching. So the teachers who already feel overwhelmed with the learning material would be least motivated to adopt this learning method. Do you remember the way kids are taught to learn Roy G? But this method has a limitation because you can't have mnemonics for everything you need to learn. It also requires dedicating specific time for different concepts to be learned. If given a huge amount of learning material, it would not be feasible to develop mnemonics for everything. Younger students may find difficulty in acquiring images for complex learning material. EB. Learning strategies proven to be effective. They are often used because they are easy, but their efficacy in building long-term learning and memory is proven by research to be not very effective. As the learning methods listed above are not effective, it is not worth spending any more time on them. Now, let's talk about the other spectrum of Dunlosky's study to understand the other strategies for learning effectively. Practice testing. Long-term learning is not very different. Practice testing is something that works as a stress for your brain muscles, and therefore it is useful for long-term retention of information. Practice testing means formative assessment, procedures conducted by teachers during the learning process in order to modify teaching and learning activities to improve student retention, typically done outside of class, and for which students receive at least right-wrong feedback, ideally guided feedback about what they did wrong, but often they are left to figure this out on their own or from peers. It includes any kind of testing students engage in on their own, including, but not limited to, actual or virtual flashcards, practice problems, questions at the end of textbook chapters, and online practice tests and supporting materials provided by textbook publishers. Practically speaking, unless we are forced to take some exam, we don't offer ourselves to test our retention of information that we learned over a period of time. But Dunlosky suggests this approach as one of the best learning techniques for deepening our knowledge about any subject. But limiting the scope of practice testing to only formal examinations is such a limited application of this great learning strategy, researchers say. One study conducted at University of Illinois in 1909 and many studies thereafter showed that if students are required to use their memory recall skills after learning, that gives much better results than by merely rereading or highlighting text. However, if the student after reading something hides the learning material portion with his hand and tries to recall the same information from his or her memory, this will positively boost long-term learning. The use of the practice test technique before a final examination does the job of retrieval of information, getting your brain to work by recalling the information that you just consumed is something that is called active participation in learning. The information learned through recalling from memory deepens the learning. The use of flashcards in learning is one of the ways to do practice testing. The flashcard, showing all the questions on the front and the right answer on the back of it, can be used for practice testing. Another way to strengthen the practice testing approach is to develop the right habit of note-taking. While learning, you must take appropriate notes. Appropriate ways of note-taking helps during your practice test or memory recall process by providing additional support to form new learning neural pathways for storage of the information. We have a complete section on note-taking later in the book that will help you understand the best ways to learn. This process is known as massed practice because you have dedicated a longer time period for studying something. This approach is called distributed practice of learning. 1. She reads the spelling of the single word and practices to learn the spelling by writing the spelling of this word several times below that word. The student here is following a massed practice. Now the student will read the spelling of a word, write this under the word, and then immediately move to reading the spelling of a next word and practice that. This practice will distribute the learning process with a gap of 19 more words before she practiced the same word again. Here, she is following the approach of distributed practice. The irony is that students prefer learning by way of massed practice because of a few reasons. Secondly, massed practice in one sitting makes you feel confident in that you will remember the information stored in your memory for the immediate purpose of taking the exam the next morning, though it is proven that this strategy fails beyond passing the exam and doesn't help to retain long-term learning. The research has proved that students retain knowledge and skills for comparatively a longer period of time if they follow the distributed practices approach instead of massed practice. Distributed practice may take comparatively more effort and longer time as compared to the massed practice. Dunlosky gives some examples where we are not conscious of following the distributed practice approach to ensure longer-term learning. Well, for example, if you wish to learn dancing, you don't do massed practice, you don't practice all types of dancing steps in one go. Rather, you practice for many days or weeks to learn different dancing steps every evening. However, you don't follow this dance learning analogy in preparation for the examination. AEC, learning strategies without enough evidence but still showing strong promises. Interleaved practice. This method of learning is a next-level approach as compared to the distributed practice. Interleaved practice involves mixing different kinds of problems or study material within a single study session. The conventional approach is to learn all aspects of one concept, solve practice problems or activities applying that concept, and then move on to the next one in a linear fashion. Under this approach also, similar to the distributed practice, you don't do the repetition of one particular concept in massed manner. Rather, you put the gaps in a way that, after practicing one type of learning material, you switch to another type of learning material for practicing. Therefore, the broader learning approach under interleaved practice is similar to the distributed practice. However, there is one key difference. While in distributed practice you practice different concepts in a row, but the topic of different material is similar in nature, in interleaved practice, you choose altogether different material for practicing. In the massed practice approach, the students will pick up the addition-related problems and practice them in a row, and then they move to subtraction, multiplication, or division problems. However, in interleaved practice, the students will practice one question of addition-related problems. Then they will pick subtraction as the next problem, then multiplication, and so on. In a 2006 Study 6, Doe Rohrer and Kelly Taylor, researchers from University of South Florida, experimented to measure the efficacy of interleaved practice versus massed practice. In the experiment, students were required to undergo 2 practice tests before they could go to the final examination. One group was asked to solve the problem related to one type of solid, say a wedge, and they were given 4 different versions of the same type of solid for practicing. In a way, they never practiced the same type of problem in a row, unlike the first group of students. It was noted that the first set of students did far better than the second group in the initial practice test. The students who did interleaved practice fared 3 times better than the students who did massed practice. Similarly, the positive effects of interleaving practice were also tested in the realm of sports. One group of students was doing the practices in a massed practice manner, IA, practicing the same pitch over and over before moving to the next type. The results showed that the students who had practiced in interleaved manner had a better hitting performance as compared to the other group. However, as compared to the strategies of practice testing and Chapter 4, Mastering the Art of Learning, Subtle Strategies for Success. Real knowledge vs. Pretend knowledge. Each of us is striving to learn the best possible ways that serves to improve our lives. Our objective is to gain deep, real knowledge and not merely surface-level knowledge. After all, the objective of learning anything new is to imbibe the new knowledge deeply within our brains and to transform that into our personal wisdom. That, in turn, helps us to make better decisions. After all, the objective of learning anything new is to imbibe the new knowledge deeply within our brains and to transform that into our personal wisdom. And therefore, how to make better decisions boils down to gaining real knowledge and not merely gaining surface-level information. Rather, you want to gain real and deep knowledge to help you take better decisions in your life. This chauffeur didn't make efforts to get the deep and real knowledge. Rather, it was all pretend knowledge. Apply Feynman's technique for gaining real knowledge. He devised one simple technique that helps you to gain real knowledge of any subject instead of merely filling you with some surface-level knowledge. This approach is a targeted learning approach. Step 1. Identify the concept. Take a sheet of paper and write the name of the concept that you want to learn at the top of that page. Step 2. Explain in plain language. Now, start explaining the concept in your own words as if you are asked to teach it to someone else. The most important thing to remember here is not to use the technical jargon that you have read in your learning material. You have to explain the concept in plain, simple language. Many people tend to use jargon or terminology of the subject in their explanation to others, even when they don't understand the concept very clearly. The approach should be to use plain and simple language, as if you are teaching the concept to your 70-year-old grandmother who has no knowledge about the concept. Here, you have to stop and go back to the learning material or previous notes prepared for learning the concept. Once you have clearly understood the missing concepts, then you need to again explain those concepts in plain language. Therefore, this Feynman technique will help you learn anything faster by honestly identifying gaps in your understanding of any concept. The Feynman technique is useful for learning a new idea, understanding an existing idea better, or preparing yourself for discussions on any complex topic. Let's move further now and talk about some more approaches to learning better. Learning by applying the 80-20 principle. In learning any new language also, the concept of 80-20 exists. If you just want 80 proficiency, maybe 2 to 3 months learning is sufficient. But Tim Ferriss states that the real trick is finding that 2.5s of any specific language. If you are more serious about learning a particular language, you need to follow Benny Lewis, founder of a blog Fluent in 3 months, and who speaks multiple languages like Spanish, French, German, Italian, Dutch, to list a few, has explained his way of learning multiple language in this interesting TED Talk. He explains the principles how he has learned so many languages following the principles of 80-20 by focusing on the most important vocabulary of any language to learn any new language. Moreover, not only language, but any aspect of learning involves 80-20 principle. As a lawyer, if one has mastered the skill in relation to those limited provisions at a deeper level, he or she would be in a position to handle any complex transaction with even lesser knowledge on the other aspects of the corporate transactions, thanks to the applicability of 80-20 principle here. Whatever area of learning you may choose, if you want to progress faster in that area, put your energy and efforts in learning the key 20 part of the skill which gives you 80 of the results. This will help you to see results faster, and you will feel motivated to learn the skills faster. Now, let's understand how our learning is done through association of connected information and in isolation in the next approach based on human psychology. Associative learning approach. Let's do a quick experiment to understand the concept of associative learning. When you try to envision your father's eyebrow, you see his eyes, cheeks, forehead, nose, chin. Why is it so difficult to recall just his eyebrow? Associative learning is a learning principle that states that ideas and experiences reinforce each other and can be mentally linked to one another. Associative learning is a theory that states that ideas reinforce each other and can be linked to one another. That's why it is difficult to recall just one eyebrow without seeing the whole face. Associative learning can be a powerful classroom management and teaching tool. There are two key types of associative learning: classical conditioning, such as in Pavlov's dog, explained below, and operant conditioning, or the use of reinforcement through rewards and punishments. Classical conditioning is a concept based on the premise that learning occurs when you learn something based on a new stimulus. The most famous example is by a Russian psychologist, Ivan Pavlov's use of dogs to demonstrate that a stimulus such as the ringing of a bell leads to a reward or food, such as the bell in Pavlov's experiments with the dogs. He, in the first step, fed his dogs with meat powder, which naturally made the dogs salivate. The first time Pavlov rang the bell, the neutral stimulus, the dogs did not salivate, but once he put the meat powder in their mouths, they began to salivate. After numerous pairings of bell and food, the dogs learned that the bell signaled that food was about to come and began to salivate when they heard the bell. Over repeated trials, the conditioned stimulus causes learning. When the conditioned stimulus, the ringing of the bell, happens before the reward, the person or the animal has time to figure out that the bell ringing means something and learn or form an association. The experiment was known as Little Albert's experiment, proved the relevance of associative learning amongst humans as well. Another form of associative learning was experimented by psychologist B.F. Skinner, known as operant conditioning. This concept involves the use of a schedule of reinforcements or rewards and punishments until the behavior is learned. For instance, if the dog were to hear the bell and step on a lever, it would receive the dog biscuit, the reward. While the basic feature of operant conditioning is reinforcement, classical conditioning relies more on association between stimuli and responses. By using these principles, you can associate your learning with some stimuli or induce some reinforcement by way of punishment. Or, for example, impressing your friend with your new language skills can be a real stimulant for you to learn better. Now, you know that if you learn better, you get a reward to impress him or her, or to get the chance to spend time with him or her to teach something that you learn. Learn anything in 20 hours. Hours. How to Learn Anything Fast, in his TED Talk 9 about how you can learn anything in 20 hours. In this world, where we have concepts like the 1,000-hour rule to become an expert in any skill, this message of learning anything in 20 hours seemed quite provocative to me in the first instance. But, to my utmost surprise, what I learned about the concept was quite practical. The idea is to learn enough that transforms you from being grossly incompetent to reasonably good at something. Take an example. Learning only a few important elements of a foreign language doesn't make you an expert, but it can make you reasonably good at the language, meaning you learned in a way that practically serves your purpose. By the way, you will see more information about how to learn the different languages in a shortest time later in this section. Therefore, if your goal is to have a reasonable understanding of some field and you don't have any intention of becoming an expert in that field, you can achieve your learning goal in 20 hours. Here are the important elements of this 20-hour roadmap to learning something new. Step 1. Deconstruct a skill. To learn any new skill, the first step is to break that skill into various small components. Now, once you have deconstructed the skill, the important thing to remember is to practice the most important parts of that skill first. The main thing here is to practice intelligently. Given our objective of becoming reasonably good at something in fewer than 20 hours, therefore, while deconstructing, you have to identify the most important sub-skills needed that will give you maximum advantage. You need to follow 80-20 principle. To give you an example of my self-publishing business, this involves quite a few skills. Now, to gain advantage through authorship, though, the most important skill to develop is to write something, but you have to learn all other skills before you can generate a self-published bestseller book. Therefore, the first step is to deconstruct the skill into various sub-skills, and then you have to choose the most important sub-skills and spend more time in practicing that. Step 2, learn just enough. When you are starting out to learn any mini-skill as a subset of the major skill, you don't need to become an expert before you start out. Rather, you need to learn just enough so that when you find yourself committing mistakes, you can self-correct yourself. To continue the previous example of self-publishing business, I started writing without any formal coaching. Rather, I just bought one of the best books on the subject about how to write and promote books on Kindle from one of the self-publishing industry veterans, namely author Steve Scott. I just learned enough and then started writing my first book. This bare minimum but quality learning helped me to write my first book. I just learned enough so I could start. Step 3, remove barriers to practice. The next step in the process is to remove any obstacles that may come as a hindrance to your practicing of the sub-skill. Learning anything new for the first time definitely brings some frustration. You don't feel like progressing faster in your chosen domain. And here you have to safeguard yourself from any distraction so you remain focused on your journey towards learning the skill. Step 4, practice for 20 hours. Now you need to practice this for 20 hours. You don't have to practice for 20 hours in one stretch. As you learn the distributed practice learning method, this approach follows that principle. This practice of 45 minutes daily builds in it the concept of spaced repetition through interleaved practice principle. As you would be doing all other things every day and then loop in the practicing of this particular skill for 45 minutes every day, the 4 steps above, if followed well, can help you become reasonably good in anything you want to learn, be it a new language, be it playing guitar, learning martial arts, or any other skill. In fact, the major barrier in learning anything new is not intellectual. Rather, it is emotional. We often get scared of sounding stupid if we are learning something new and miss out few things. And that fear of sounding stupid often stops us from trying anything new, whereas in reality, you can learn anything if you really wish to. Again, taking a personal example, when I published my first book along with my full-time day job, I remember writing every evening for around 30 minutes to 1 hour after my office hours. This daily practice of writing 1,000 words every evening gave me a reward of a 25,000-word book in a period of 5 to 6 weeks. I know 20 hours to learn anything new seems very little, but this approach of spreading 20 hours and 30 even days is based on the principles on which our brain's neural network and memory works, as evidenced by the studies on distributed practice and interleaved practice. As stated earlier, this approach doesn't target to make you an expert, which we will cover in the later section of the book, but you will get rid of your false inner excuses and get comfortable with trying anything new, be it learning some musical instrument or practicing any foreign language, or any other thing. Now, let's move to the next section of the book to talk about different learning styles and interesting findings about the concept. Chapter 5, Alpha, Beyond the Labels, Unpacking Learning Styles in the Digital Age. Different learning styles. You must have already read about the articles explaining about everyone having a different preference of learning something new. It is said that some people learn by reading the material, but some like to learn by watching it. And some people say that they are more of a listener, while few others would say that they learn better by practically doing it by their hands. The proponents of different learning style theory have different versions of learning styles. Most people say there are 3 styles, namely auditory, visual, and physical. But it is more often referred that there are 7 different learning styles. Some people may find one style as their dominant style of learning, with far less use of other styles. Some people use mixed styles for learning. There is no right or wrong style, and also no one has a fixed learning style for life that can't be changed. Oh, but why is this idea of different learning styles so popular in the first place? It is because parents tend to think that their children are being taught an education specific to their kids' learning style. Similarly, teachers also start to believe that they are more sensible towards the needs of the children to help them learn in the best possible way, as most suitable to them. Now, there are different schools of thoughts about the efficacy of different styles in the process of learning, and we'll come to that. But before that, let's have a quick look at these various styles and what does it mean to learn by a specific style. And there are 7 different learning styles as stated below. In this style, you prefer using pictures, images, and spatial understanding. Oral style means sound and music is your preferred way of learning in this style. You like to learn primarily by using words, both in speech and writing, if you have verbal learning style. Under this style, you prefer to learn by using your body, hands, and sense of touch. Using logic, reasoning, pattern detection, and systems are the main drivers for learning in this style. You learn by way of idea diagrams, process maps, etc. Here, you enjoy learning in groups or with other people. You learn best when brainstorming with others, bouncing ideas at each other, proposing and polishing ideas. For those loving solitude and enjoy their own company, this is their preferred mode of learning. Brain parts and learning style. There is something unique about this learning style. Brain science has found that each learning style uses different parts of the brain. Researchers using brain imaging technologies have been able to find out the key areas of the brain responsible for each learning style. The verbal, the temporal and frontal lobes, especially 2 specialized regions called Broca's and Wernicke's areas in the left hemisphere of these 2 lobes, are responsible for verbal style of learning. Solitary, the frontal and parietal lobes and the limbic system are also active with this style. Of course, you may say that you love a particular way of learning as compared to others. I personally think that reading verbal, and listening are my most preferred ways of learning. I don't feel like learning through visuals or videos much. Yes, everyone has different preferences for learning, and there's no research out there that shows that one method of learning is superior than another. Christian Jarrett, a cognitive neuroscientist, states that there is very little evidence about the efficacy of the different learning style. Whatever evidence is out there is very weak to justify usage of any specific method for learning. Convincing evidence for learning styles would show that people who preferred one learning style learned better when taught material in their favored way, whereas a different group with a different preference learned the same material better when taught in their favored fashion. A study conducted on few students to test the efficacy of learning based on their learning style proved that there was no strong support that verbal learners and visual learners should be given different types of learning material. Jarrett stated that usually learning anything depends more on the type of learning material instead of learners' preferred style of learning. The nature of learning material determines the learning style primarily. Or, for example, if you have to learn French, learning it pictorially cannot obviously be the preferred way. Similarly, If you want to learn geometry, it is not possible to learn it verbally. If above is true, then is the learning style a total myth? Leading experts in the field state that the myth of different learning system is not merely a small misconception, rather, it is causing harm to the students. The experts say that believing in different learning styles would prompt the teacher to teach the students as per their strengths, but this approach will not address the shortcomings of students. To put it simply, not prompting a student to learn by reading the material, because the student thinks that he learns better by visual or video, would reduce the learning ability of students by reading. Professor Stephen Dinham from the Melbourne Graduate School of Education summarizes the danger of teaching to this myth in his recent book, Leading, Teaching and Learning. However, it does matter because of the problems and harm that can be caused by categorization, labeling and limiting of learning experiences of students through the continued belief in and application of so-called learning style. The danger of assuming the learning style preference theory is that by labeling students as a certain type of learner and changing the teaching style to match this type of learning, we, as parents or teachers, wrongly encourage students to develop a fixed mindset. Rather, students need to be encouraged to think that they can learn in any specific way if they put their efforts to that. Also, imparting or designing education specific to different learning styles doesn't make economic sense either, because certain learning style study materials may come with a high cost and therefore not easily accessible to all students. Learning by note-taking. Besides different learning styles, probably you'd have also heard about discussions on different note-taking styles for comprehending the information being consumed. Most people inadvertently think that they will remember the information in the future also while learning something new. I admit that learning anything complicated and more detailed is not comparable to simply remembering a few digits of a password, but the idea here is to impress upon you the need for creating effective tools for later retrieval when you need it most. It is relevant to mention here that the role of note-taking is not merely limited to memory retention purposes, rather it also helps you to better comprehend the targeted learning material. Better notes help you remember concepts, develop meaningful learning skills, and gain a better understanding of a topic. Learning how to take better study notes in your classroom sessions helps improve recall and understanding of what you are learning because using different note-taking strategies is important, especially as you progress through high school and transition to college or university. And there are several note-taking techniques you can use to start taking better notes in class. The Cornell method has been and remains one of the most popular note-taking strategies among students. At the bottom of the page, you should write paragraphs summarizing the information contained in the notes. It is important that you try to summarize as much as possible and to be smart when note-taking. On the left-hand side, you will note down the keyword or concept that relates to your section of notes. The last section, labeled Summary, should be left blank during class as it is intended for use when you are reviewing and studying the class notes. The Cornell method ensures that your notes are neatly organized, summarized, and easy to review later. It allows you to pull major ideas about whatever you learned during your class or important event. This method is based on the use of visual aids to improve how the brain processes information. In this method, you generally start with a central idea in the center of the page. I have implemented and found this idea very useful in writing my books. Take any of your complex learning material that has various components covered in it. The outlining note-taking method uses headings and bullet points to organize topics. This method is most useful when learning about topics that include a lot of detail. No matter which note-taking method you use, there will be times when you cannot keep pace with the class and your hand and fingers will begin to hurt from writing. I learned this technique early in my life while taking notes in class as well as from textbooks. Each symbol had different meaning of my understanding. For example, they are stated for showing difference in two concepts, whereas the triangle shape meant that there is an important definition covered in that paragraph of the book. This approach is a less rigid approach for taking notes. Like mind mapping, where you prepare circles with arrows for different kind of interconnected thoughts, this method also requires you to be authentically noting your understanding about what you have learned. The flow system approach was mentioned by Scott Young in his book Learn More, Study Less. In this approach, you start by just writing the major ideas of what you have learned, the lazy man's method of note-taking. In other words, this method already captures the element of test-taking alongside the delivery of the information. And now you have learned about multiple ways of note-taking. You might already knowingly or unconsciously be using some of these techniques for note-taking. The next question that arises is, what is the best learning method that you should use for effective learning? Cornell's method is stated to be a widely used method of note-taking, but here you have to prepare a summary for each learning session that may be time-consuming. I personally think that the note-taking approach is more of a personal preference of every individual. For me, I used putting abbreviations and symbols as a note in my earlier days, and currently I use mind mapping to structure my thoughts around the book. I find these note-taking methods helpful to learn, comprehend, and memorize the information better. You should also try different styles of note-taking and then stick to the one that suits you best, considering your personal preference and time available to you. Taking notes on laptops rather than in longhand is increasingly common. Researchers examined the question whether taking notes at computer is better than writing notes by hand. After studying, many researchers have suggested that laptop note-taking is less effective than longhand note-taking for learning. Further research suggests that even when laptops are used solely to take notes, there may still be impaired learning involved because their use results in shallower processing. In 3 studies, the researchers found that students who took notes on laptops performed worse on conceptual questions than students who took notes longhand. The studies show that whereas taking more notes can be beneficial, laptop note-takers' tendency to transcribe lectures verbatim rather than processing information and reframing it in their own words is detrimental to learning. I personally feel that when I write down my goals, my areas of learning, and other items in my journal, they stick much longer in my head. The next chapter explains how you can learn effectively by implementing gamification and elements of challenge to speed up your learning process. Chapter 6. Level up your learning. Mastering skills through play. Everyone loves games. If you think games are only for kids, you should consider revisiting your thoughts. We never stop having fun and playing. Only the forms change. Games stay with us for our entire lives. New games are avenues for something deeper and more meaningful learning. Games promote situational learning, or, in other words, learning that occurs in groups of practice during immersive experiences. Oftentimes, playing games is the first method children use to explore higher-order thinking skills associated with creating, evaluating, analyzing, and applying new knowledge. But how would you make something that is tedious, cumbersome, and a heavy subject so interesting that it becomes fun to learn? The answer is by introducing the element of gamification in the learning. How would you feel if you were told that you can learn anything like a game? Welcome to the world of gamification technology through a learning. The gamification of Learning 12 is an educational approach to motivate students to learn by using a video game design and game elements in learning environments. The goal is to maximize enjoyment and engagement through capturing the interest of learners and inspiring them to continue learning. Wikipedia defines gamification as the use of game thinking and game mechanics in non-game contexts to engage the people for solving the problems. It further explains that gamification broadly is a process of defining the elements which comprise games that make those games fun and motivate players to continue playing, and using those same elements in a non-game context to influence behavior. Games applied in learning can be considered as serious games, where the learning experience is centered around serious stories. The serious story is impressive in quality and part of a thoughtful process to achieve learning goals. One of the examples of gamification is simulation training to teach students to learn to drive a car. The simulation training puts the element of game in learning a seemingly tough real-life skill and prepares the learner with enough skills to go on the road with little practice. Another example of learning through gamification is learning trading into stocks, commodities, or currencies by opening a demo account with the trading and brokerage firms. One of my friends, a finance professional, used this technique to master his learning in currency trading, and he shared his experience with me. To start learning, he simply opened a demo account with one of the currency trading platforms, which is quite a straightforward process these days, thanks to multiple online trading apps available to help a new entrants who wish to learn this skill. So this gamification method of learning provided a safe environment for him to brush up his skills and then master it sooner. Below are some major benefits of learning through gamification. It gives a conducive learning environment. It gives a better learning experience. If you learn new skills in a fun manner, and if you are deeply engaged in the game, it can significantly enhance your understanding of the new subject. You don't have to wait too long to know whether you learned or not, unlike formal examinations. Moreover, the spaced repetition strategies in the gamification do the job of cementing your learning, applicable to most of the learning needs. Gamification can be used to fulfill most learning needs, including induction and onboarding, product sales, customer support, soft skills, awareness creation, and compliance. You may want to check out one gamification method listed below for enhancing the performance of athletes by giving them challenges. There is a tool called Strava, which is probably one of the best gamification methods of learning and prompting athletes to meet the newer challenges of running. Now compare the Strava app learning method with normal running, cycling, or exercising every day in the morning. Everybody wants to see a goal or a challenge to be conquered, and gamification provides that element to you. Duolingo is another gamification example for learning any new language in a fun, quick, and effective way, learning by taking challenges. It is not always that you have to involve technology or devise a certain system of gamification to promote learning. Oftentimes, merely introducing an element of challenge in your regular work enhances your desire to learn better. In my corporate world experience, I have few examples where putting an element of challenge and fair competition amongst the different teams in the company has helped improve the learning experience of the team as a whole. The different scars then used to identify different areas where they would take a challenge of providing a measurable improvement in that particular area that involved exploring and learning various facets for bringing in the desired improvement. Or for example, if there was some gap in logistics management, the SCA team will take up a goal to set up a standard operating procedure to provide a solution to that goal, and that would involve learning all the facts of legal or tax-related provisions, as any change in billing or shipping location may have an impact from sales tax to festive or custom duties or tax impact. I have one more example of learning by taking challenges in one other organization, where there was another kind of challenge and reward mechanism. This approach prompted the individuals and teams to keep learning the best ways to deliver measurable impact and improvement in multiple areas of business. Introducing challenges and learning makes the learning secondary. The participants focus more on winning the challenges and are ready to upgrade their learning for the purposes of excelling in that challenge. The feelings of satisfaction and accomplishment in winning the challenge takes the driver's seat, and learning happens as a natural progression. The learning becomes a necessary tool to win the challenge. If you have some experience of working with corporate, You'd have already noticed that corporate trainings and team activities these days are much more oriented towards introducing challenges, which in turn enhances human learning and performance. Hence, gamification and introducing challenges do have the great potential to enhance the quality and pace of learning. You may try some strategies or use some apps stated in this chapter to boost your learning. Chapter 7. Beyond the textbook, leveraging technology for experiential learning. For centuries, it is well known that one of the best ways to learn is by way of teaching others. But now, scientists from the last few decades have been researching why this method works so well. It is because explaining something to other person requires you to retrieve the information on the subject from your memory. It requires you to arrange your thoughts about the subject in your memory clearly. The scientists conducted research and found that students who are asked to tutor others work harder to understand the subject material, recall it more accurately, and apply it more effectively in teaching others. There was evidence that the students who learned by teaching others scored comparatively higher than those who had just learned only for themselves. And there are studies 13 that also show that the older siblings are more intelligent compared to their younger siblings and have a higher IQ as they teach their younger siblings the things they need to learn. The scientists at Stanford University have developed a cutting-edge tool for learning by teaching, and they call it a teaching agent. This teaching agent is a virtual computer system that can learn, ask questions, and give feedback just like a normal student. The scientists have developed this teachable agent and call it Betty's brain, which has learned thousands of hours of subject information, which is taught to it by numerous high school students. When the students are teaching these teachable agents, their own understanding becomes much clearer as they try to organize their thoughts in their head cohesively, recalling from their memory in order to explain the virtual brain well. The study of Betty's brain, published in one journal, that the students engaged in learning by way of teaching had spent more time going over the study material and learned it more thoroughly. One group was asked to learn for themselves. The other group was asked to teach virtual pupils or teachable agents, TARs. The results of another study 15 revealed that students learning by preparing to teach intervention developed a more detailed and better organized concept map of the problem compared with other students. Such students were also noted to be engaged in more metacognitive processing strategies and had higher levels of mathematics problem-solving achievement compared with other students who simply learned for their own purposes. The protégé effect helped students learn better because of the following reasons. Expecting to teach others encourages the student to learn in a more structured way so that they can seek out key pieces of information out of the material they have learned. The learning with the intent of teaching often prompts the student to use additional techniques beyond those used when learning for yourself, which leads to a more comprehensive understanding of the material. Expecting to teach also increases the motivation to learn, meaning that students generally make a greater effort to learn for those that they will teach, and they do for themselves. The importance of teaching to learn is gaining acceptance amongst educators. The educators are creating situations where the students can teach other students to learn better. Chapter 8. Mastering the art of rapid learning. Learning enables us to lead an enriched and fulfilled life, as we are able to put the acquired knowledge to work for us. And there is a quote by Frank A. Clark that goes like this: the more you learn, the more you earn. An adult human brain is around 3 pounds, around 2 of the total body weight. People who work at McDonald's or who work as a laborer at a construction site all have a meager hourly wage for manual labor, but people who use their brains and keep on learning and enhancing their mental faculties always maintain the potential to earn more and lead a better lifestyle. In the previous sections, we talked about various ways to learn better, as proven by researchers. In the current section, we will talk about the ways in which you can upgrade your learning capabilities to the next levels and reach the top and become an expert in your field. You would want to upgrade your skills to attain higher levels in your chosen pursuits. In this section, you will learn a few ways that will help you to improve your learning potential and help you to become an expert in your chosen field. You need to know what level of learning you are currently at. And therefore, let's look at a few methodologies to assess the level of your existing stage of learning. 4 stages for learning any new skills. In human psychology, there are 4 stages of learning that transition an individual from the state of incompetence to competence in any skill. It was initially described as 4 stages for learning any new skills, and the theory was developed by Noel Birch in 1970. This theory is also often referred to as the competency ladder from the perspective of acquiring new skills. The theory explains that initially, when we start to learn anything, we even don't know what we don't know. But when we become aware about our incompetence, we work on improving those skills, and soon we learn and consciously act in a competent manner. With enough practice, we become so competent that we are even unconscious of our competence, and that's the last stage of competence, where competent behavior becomes your second nature. At this stage, the individual does not understand or know how to do something and does not necessarily recognize the deficiency in his learning. This stage requires that the individual must recognize their own competence and the value of the new skill before moving on to the next stage. The length of time an individual spends in this stage depends on the strength of the stimulus to learn. In this stage of conscious incompetence, though, the individual does not understand or know how to do something. It does recognize the deficit in his learning, as well as the value of a new skill in addressing the deficit. Being mindful of the incompetence and the requirement of skill, the individual starts to put effort into learning. The making of mistakes can be integral to the learning process at this stage, meaning the learner would mostly not be in a position to rightly analyze the correct action in this stage. In the next stage, the individual understands or knows how to do something. By putting efforts, making mistakes in the earlier stage, the individual is now competent at this stage, but demonstrating the skill or knowledge requires concentration. This is the final stage of mastering any skills. Before reaching this stage, the individual has already put so much time into practicing a skill that it has become second nature and can be performed easily. This is because skill has become a part of the subconscious mind, and it doesn't require active involvement of your brain. To understand the 4 stages of competence, let's take an example of learning to drive a car. Only if you have strong stimulus to learn, i.e., you want to independently travel on your own, then only you would want to put efforts in learning to drive the car. You commit mistakes in driving, maybe getting some minor scratches or dents is the cost you pay for learning in this second stage. Then you reach the last stage where you even don't need to pay any attention to the car's function. Here, you have achieved the stage of unconscious competence. It focuses on explaining how students acquire skills through formal instructions and practice. The report proposes that any individual goes through 5 different stages of learning. This is the first stage of learning. Here, the student needs to spend enough time in understanding the rules of learning in that particular area. As the novice begins to cope with real situations and develops an understanding of the relevant context of operation in the area of learning, the next step comes when he starts to take note of the additional aspects of the situation or domain. Since the individual has just started to get hold of the rules, he must spend enough time in learning the rules yet. Competence develops when the individual develops organizing principles to quickly access the particular rules that are relevant to the specific task at hand. Hence, competence is characterized by actively choosing a course of action. At this stage, the individual develops competency, So he should spend most of the time practicing what he has learned, with lesser time needed in learning or remembering the rules. By enough practice, he now doesn't need to again refer to rules as in the case of novice or advanced beginner. With the force of involvement, he is now ready for skill enhancement. This is the ultimate level of learning. Rather, he develops intuitive grasp of situations based on his deep tacit understanding, based on experience of various scenarios handled due to practice. As noted in the previous theory of hierarchy of competence, this stage is equivalent to the unconscious competence, and your intuition is strongly developed to make quick decisions. While the proficient performer, based on his immersion in the skillful activities, sees what needs to be done, he needs to yet decide what needs to be done. But the expert performer not only sees what needs to be done, he, based on his vast repertoire of situational discriminations, can immediately decide how to achieve that goal. Thus, the ability to make the subtle and refined distinction between the actions to be taken in different situations makes the expert performer, setting him apart from merely a proficient performer. This level is the apex level, and therefore one needs to put efforts to keep practicing to maintain such skills to make all his decisions largely unconscious and effortless. I believe you would have noted enough symptoms of learners at different stages and probably would have made some assessment of your own level of competency. Unless you already find yourself as an expert in any area, now is the time you would ask what specifically it would need and how much time it takes to become an expert in your identified pursuits. Most people have probably already heard about the 10,000-hour rule to become an expert. Based on his research, he noted that few top musicians took around 10,000 hours to become expert in their field. It so happened that few musicians started so early in their life to start playing their instrument, and by the time they spent 10,000 hours practicing their craft, they had become masters in their craft. Just do this simple calculation. You put 40 hours in a week to work, and you work 50 weeks in a year. Assuming you get 2 weeks of vacations, that makes it 2,000 hours in 1 year, and therefore 10,000 hours of practice means 5 years spent in a full-time job. Now, taking this research of Erickson as a basis, Malcolm Gladwell, in his bestseller book Outlier, The Story of Success, covered this 10,000-hour rule in his book. His version of this rule in his book was seemingly indicating as if becoming an expert in any field is subject to some objective criterion of timelines. Spend 10,000 hours and become expert in anything you want. It became popular in a way that 10,000 hours was considered some magical number, and by the time one devotes these many hours, he or she is guaranteed to be an expert. One press release reported 17, and Gladwell likely drew his conclusion of 10,000-hour rule in his book based on Erickson's paper, where 40 violinists in Germany were studied to get more details about how much time it takes to reach their level of expertise. It was found in the research that the top 2 groups of violinists spent significantly more time practicing than the others. The release reported that Erickson, the original researcher of the paper, stated that the 10,000-hour rule criterion popularized by Gladwell couldn't be an objective test that could be applied to any skill uniformly. He stated that there can't be any objective or magical number of hours that would mean a guarantee to become an expert. Hours of merely repeating the same activity does not turn anyone into an expert immediately 18. Rather, Erickson explains that deliberate practice is something that makes someone an expert in his chosen pursuits. Erickson explains that there are 3 different types of practices that people follow, but it is only deliberated practice that matters.